Welcome to FCLE Seminar, the Florida Civic Literacy Exam Podcast. I'm your host, Mercedes Musto. Today, we are taking a look at landmark Supreme Court case. This one's called New York Times versus the United States. The New York Times? Yes, that's the one. And ultimately, this case became known as the Pentagon Papers case. Sounds really serious, huh? But it is. This is all based on the guide put together by the Florida Department of Education. I've got links to that study stuff in the show notes, so check those out at FCLE Seminar on Spotify and YouTube. And hey, we've got a new website. It's FCLEseminar.com. Got it? Great. Let's get started. Landmark Supreme Court case number 14, New York Times versus United States, 1971. Case background. This case was known as the Pentagon Papers case. It set off a dramatic clash between press freedom, First Amendment, and national security. Oh, you know, that national security stuff keeps edging into our constitutional liberties, like in Schenck versus the United States, episode 6 for reference. So in 1971, the New York Times and the Washington Post newspapers began publishing excerpts from a classified Defense Department study known as the Pentagon Papers. This document contained information about the U.S.'s involvement in the Vietnam War. You know, the very controversial war that the students in Tinker versus Des Moines, you know, that case where they were silently protesting with the black armband symbolic speech, First Amendment, right from, you know, the last episode. Okay. See now, the president at the time was Richard Nixon, and his administration argued against the publication of classified defense documents, saying that it would harm national security. The administration then invoked a thing called the doctrine of prior restraint. This is like a type of censorship that occurs before. So in this case, basically, the government was trying to stop the confidential information before it actually had been printed, claiming that it would harm national security. Naturally, this case got national attention and reached the Supreme Court, where the justices confronted the fundamental question, does the government, in this case the Nixon administration, have the power to prevent the press from publishing classified documents in the name of national security? The court's decision, in a per curiam decision, that's Latin for by the court as a whole, the Supreme Court rejected the government's attempt to block publication. The court ruled in favor of the newspapers, really in favor and support of freedom of press. Now, the court acknowledged the government's interest in national security, of course. The court emphasized that prior restraint of the press was a drastic measure and should be used only in the most extreme circumstances and with necessary proof. The court held that the government failed to prove that the publication would cause an, quote, inevitable, direct, and immediate event imperiling the safety of American forces. In other words, they found that the government's claims of national security were not sufficient to justifying the stop of the publication. This decision reaffirmed the importance of free press. See, it sent a strong message that the government cannot easily suppress information, even when it deems it sensitive or potentially damaging. While the court recognized that the government's legitimate interest in national security, it also emphasized that the burden of proof lies with the government to demonstrate the necessity of prior restraint. Constitutional principle. The principle here is the First Amendment. The First Amendment states that, quote, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Freedom of the press. There you go. This landmark Supreme Court case recognized a longstanding American tradition of opposing government censorship and the importance of a free press in holding the government accountable. Let's review. Here are the key takeaways from New York Times versus the United States. We learned about the concept of prior restraint, which in this case was the government's attempt to prevent the publication of information before it was released. We also hit up on the First Amendment's freedom of the press. Here, the court emphasized the importance of a free press and the dangers of prior restraint. And lastly, the Pentagon Papers case underscored the importance of a free press in uncovering or exposing potential abuses of power. In essence, the Pentagon's Papers case reaffirmed the fundamental principle that the government cannot easily suppress information, even when it claims national security concerns. It emphasized the vital role of free press in a democratic society. Hey, thanks for listening. Join us again on FCLE Seminar, a Florida Civic Literacy podcast, so you can start studying for your test. The important thing is to start studying and, hey, study like a rock star. Like, subscribe, and leave your questions or comments for us at FCLE Seminar on YouTube, Spotify, or FCLEseminar.com. This podcast is listener-supported. Contributions can be made via the listener support link on Spotify, or you can buy me a coffee in the link in the show notes. This is your host, Mercedes Musto. Join me again on FCLE Seminar, a Florida Civic Literacy Exam podcast, so you can pass the FCLE.